My name is Cantrill Fenwick, and I've recently completed an MPhil thesis at Newcastle on the pipe organ in France during the French Revolution. I've spent over 25 years as an organist of various churches and cathedrals, and have come to this project as both a fledgling postgraduate researcher and as a performing musician. The recordings you'll hear were made specially for this podcast. I want to start with a quote from the minutes of the Committee of Public Instruction of the National Convention. On the 28th of September 1794, a Deputy Merlin addressed the committee concerning the provision of music at civic festivals on the Champ de Mars in Paris. He said, "I spoke of 13 orchestras. In fact, I would like only one, which I would place in the centre, and which I would strengthen with an average organ. And instead of the other 12 orchestras, 12 great organs would be distributed at the circumference, to which would be added voices of all kinds. The organ is suitable for the songs and the festivities of a great people gathered in a large space. I invite Gossec to try this novelty. It may not be such a poor service to France to put this instrument in a place of honour." This is just one striking example of the impact of the French Revolution of 1789 on the pipe organ. These suggestions proposed placing an instrument generally perceived to be conservative and liturgical out of doors in a secular context, playing with other instruments and singers, and contributing to a highly politicised revolutionary musical soundscape. Although these particular plans never came to fruition, the Festival of Reunion in Paris on the 10th of August 1793 did feature 5 organs. And we know that Nicolas Jean Méraud and his son Jean-Nicolas participated in open-air festivals, playing patriotic melodies on organs mounted on platforms to accompany the passing parades. The context of these proposals appears to support the supposition that the revolution represented an abrupt fracture in the tradition of organ playing in France, as defined by the 2 widely admired schools which came before and after it. First, the classical school, as characterised by the music of Couperin and de Grigny and the organs of the Clicquot dynasty, and the symphonic school of Widor, Guilmont and Cavaillé-Coll. Fenner-Douglas argues that the revolution left French organs in ruins. Certainly, the sudden and dramatic impoverishment of the country's organ culture, that is, music, instruments and players, including the loss of many hundreds of organs and the destitution of the profession of organist after 1790, does indeed represent a fracture. But the wider context can only be understood by examining the decades either side of the revolution. By 1780, the organ's literature and performance practices had been diversified by the ascendancy of the piano, the popularity of theatrical music, the use of the organ at the concert spirituel, and the influence of the Enlightenment philosophers and the galant style. This meant a move away from the lullying gravity of the repertoire of the 17th century and a recognition of the declining value of the liturgical tradition in which the organ had prospered. The Benedictine monk and organ builder, Dom Bédot, exposed the lethargy of the faithful, remarking, "The scant religious belief which is displayed in our time may thus be heaping ridicule on the organ's tones, which are the constant background to boredom in church, where social considerations still incline us to go." This aesthetic is typified by the Mass in G minor by Jean-Jacques Beauvalet Charpentier, composed between 1779 and 1782. At first sight, there are many similarities with the music of François Couperin from some 100 years earlier. The Kyrie comprises the same 5 versets with titles that reflect the conventions of the classical style: prélude, fugue, récit de flûte, trio de grosses tierces, and grand chœur. But here the similarities end. There is a notable lack of counterpoint, a reduced harmonic vocabulary and rhythm with simplified bass lines throughout, and melodies betray a temporal influence. This music seems to cater for an amateur market and fits Dom Bédot's characterization of mediocre late 18th century organists who, he said, reject the pedals because they were not in the habit of using them. A year after the storming of the Bastille, the greatest French organ builders were dead, and many churches were being used as barracks, stables, public stores, workshops and meeting halls. 20 years later, Alexandre Etienne Charron commented that there was no longer hope that the art of the organ could be useful, reflecting a contemporary viewpoint that the revolutionary years would leave no beneficial legacy for the organ. Nonetheless, it is possible to trace the roots of the symphonic school to the early years of the 19th century, particularly following the establishment of the Paris Conservatoire in 1795 and due to the advocacy of reformers such as Fêtes. It is also clear that the organists who enabled this amelioration of fortunes survived the 1790s by adapting and making use of pre-revolutionary musical skills, contacts, and economic knowledge, bringing about significant long-term changes. Furthermore, the heritage of extant 18th century organs exists in part because the Temporary Commission for the Arts played a vital role in preserving organs from sale or destruction after 1793. But more revelatory is the fact that revolutionaries themselves came to recognise the instrument's aesthetic and historic value, including the beauty of the pipes and a lovely quality of sound, placing the organ at the centre of civic attempts to redefine a liturgical past. This led to the conservation of certain instruments used in Republican worship and festivals, and advances one of the most intriguing conundrums of the time. Despite the abject destruction and neglect of many instruments, when crowned heads fell, the organ was the sacred king of instruments. Clearly, the revolutionary era presents a more complex set of circumstances, and not all outcomes were negative. The French musicologist François Sabatier estimates that around 2,000 organs existed in France before the Revolution. When monastic possessions were put at the disposal of the nation in 1790, a total of 522 organs were auctioned and a further 418 were destroyed, including the largest organ in France, Jean-Baptiste Nicolas Lefebvre's 5-manual 67-stop instrument at Saint-Martin, Tours. Parishes purchased 184 displaced organs as replacement instruments, often at rock-bottom prices, and others were simply left in their disused or repurposed churches, becoming badly damaged from neglect. The most unfortunate instruments were to end up in the hands of a wood merchant or a plumber satisfied with paying low prices for first-class materials. In what can only be seen as a catalogue of errors, the history of the organ of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris well illustrates the confusion the revolution could cause. Originally an abbey, the church was closed when monastic property was confiscated. The 17th century Pierre Thierry organ was left intact, but the building was then designated as a refinery for saltpeter. The minutes of the Temporary Commission for the Arts record that a citizen Lardet, a carpenter, asks for 600 livres for the wood intended for the partition of the organ of the former church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, to preserve it from the lighting of the first furnaces in February 1794. Given temporary reprieve, the organ was essentially redundant and was finally transferred to the church of Saint-Eustache in Paris in 1801. Saint-Germain was then reinstituted as a parish church in 1805, and when Saint-Eustache refused to return their instrument, the church required a new organ. This, built by Thierry in 1679, was obtained from the former abbey of Saint-Victor in Paris and installed by Jean Sommet. A 4-manual 50-stop organ of great historic value, it proved a worthy replacement for the first Thierry instrument, and parts of it still exist. The introduction of the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790 represented a test of revolutionary loyalty. An oath-taking ceremony held at Notre Dame in January 1791 included representational objects arranged around the altar: a civic crown, a club topped with a bonnet of liberty, a stack of weapons, asserting the consensus of king, nation, and church. The king's removal from this triumvirate of power and the declaration of the French Republic on the 21st of September 1792 saw the adornments of monarchy full, including the Musique du Roi, located at Versailles. The history of the palace chapel organ illustrates how even those organs saved from sale or destruction could still face years of malfeasance. This particular instrument, rebuilt by Robert Clicquot and inaugurated by François Couperin in 1711, was narrowly rescued from sale by the organ builder Sommet and Jean-Louis Bèche, former maître de chant des pages at Versailles. Despite some damage to the case, the royal emblems or signes were removed in 1794. It remained undisturbed in the chapel throughout the Revolution, only to be radically transformed by Cavaillé-Coll in 1872-73. All that remained of the Clicquot design were the case, the original keyboards repurposed elsewhere in the palace, and a few pipes. The stop list was otherwise 19th century in conception. The Commission for Organs, created in 1933, decided to reconstruct the Clicquot specification in 1936. In a strange turn of events, the remaining original pipework was removed, along with the rest of the Cavaillé-Coll organ, and relocated. This Victor Gonzalez reconstruction was itself discarded when a further project was undertaken in 1995, when Jean-Luc Boisseau and Bertrand Catillot reconstructed Clicquot's 1710 design, and this is the instrument which now sits above the chapel altar. Before the creation and intervention of the Temporary Commission for the Arts in 1793, the sale and destruction of organs in Paris had run unchecked. By 1793, only 16 instruments remained in place. The French Revolutionary Wars played out across this period, and much can be read in the Commission's minutes about the erroneous urge to snatch the bellows and pipes from organs of a metal supposed to be lead to make bullets. The Commission was also clear that removing organ bellows for use in forges was an inconvenience without advantage. The engineer Claude Pierre Mollard assumed a central role in the preservation of some of Paris's most notable organs during the years of the Commission's activity. He was responsible for writing a report on the state of organs in April 1794, including those at Notre Dame and Saint-Sulpice. Also key to their welfare was the fact that these organs were now being used in Republican worship, following the emergence of the cults of Reason in 1793 and the Supreme Being in 1794. And as Mollard wrote in 1794, even a mediocre organist could advantageously take the place of a fairly large number of musicians for all national festivals. After the proclamation of the Republic, the National Convention had imposed a new calendar. The 12 months were divided into 3 10-day weeks, or décades, with the 10th day, the décadie, a day of rest and festivity. The organist of the former royal abbey of Saint-Denis, Ferdinand-Albert Gautier, played for the inauguration of the 10-day celebrations there in November 1793, when he wrote, "Young women assembled in the choir of the Temple of Reason, and there they sang lively songs clad in diaphanous draperies, a scene of riot. The tune of the Cadet Roussel was one of those I was compelled to accompany as a chorus, as well as several others of the same kind. The Marseillaise was not forgotten and was enthusiastically called for. The Carmagnole and Ça ira formed part of the service. But the most remarkable thing about it all was that the mayor, a former priest, was in the pulpit singing the verses which the others repeated in chorus. I'm not saying this on report of others. I saw it with my own eyes, and I heard it with my ears." Sadly, the organ of Saint-Denis didn't survive the revolution unscathed. On the 6th of September 1798, Gautier described the damage done to the instrument by the removal of the church's roof and glass. The organ had been flooded, and this, he said, in addition to the damage caused by all kinds of malicious people, had managed to destroy this magnificent instrument. Not all Parisian churches were converted into temples, but for those buildings used by the revolutionary cults, the organ seems to have been used in line with old liturgical habits, including sounding processions and leading singing. The Daubé brothers of Châteaudun, Eure et Loire played the organ at the former church of La Madeleine, and records dating to the 21st of January 1795 recount the use of the organ during the commemoration of the just punishment of the last King of France. As part of the town's celebrations, a procession went to the Salle Decadaire, the former church, to listen to the organists playing patriotic tunes. Now, the decision to play the organ in this particular context was probably not without calculation. The Daubets had a cousin, a refractory priest, who was guillotined in October 1794. What was played on this occasion is difficult to state with any surety, but pre-revolutionary marches, such as those of Jean-Jacques Beauvalet-Charpentier, published in his Organ Journal in 1785, almost certainly provided models for the Republican requirement for ceremonial music. In terms of hymn singing, from the earliest years of the Revolution, well-known folk tunes or Catholic plain chant hymns were used for communal singing, and the transformation of the Easter carol O Filii et Filiae is typical. When church lands were seized, the clergy were satirised with freshly penned verses alternating with a chorus of catchy alleluias. The Pope is a turkey, the Cardinal a knave, and the Archbishop a scoundrel. Alleluia. Good examples of original compositions in the genre hymnique include the hymns of Nicolas Séjean and Étienne Nicolas Méhul, composed in 1793 and 1794. The figured bass line in the Méhul includes an obvious nod to the organist's know-how in realising an accompaniment and supports the idea that the organ was the main instrument at these festivities. Although it became infamous across Europe, this image was published in Germany, we know very little about the musical content of the Festival of Reason held in Notre-Dame de Paris in 1793. A written sequence of music, addresses and demonstrations devised for the Festival of the Elderly, held in the Church of Saint-Laurent, Paris in 1798, is more explicit, including both songs and hymns accompanied by the organ. Here we can see the organ plays a large piece at the beginning with drums and trumpets. There are demonstrations, including fencing, and military music, hymn, coronation of citizens leads to the Marseillaise. The presence of this final item immediately suggests to me a piece composed during the Revolution which continues to define the epoch, and that is Balbastre's Marche des Marseillaise et l'air ça ira. This work grew out of the tradition of programmatic improvisations, stretching from Daquin in the first half of the 18th century through the Revolution and well into the 19th century. The Te Deum was a particularly popular extended example of this genre, containing as many as 15 separate sections, including an arresting portrayal of natural chaos at the words "We believe that thou shalt come to be our judge," or the Iudex Crederis. And the dramatist Louis-Sébastien Mercier wrote evocatively about the composer Daquin. More sublime than ever, Daquin thundered in the Iudex Crederis, instilling listeners' hearts with impressions so vivid and so profound that everyone paled and shivered. Many of these demonstrative elements can be found in Balbastre's variations on the Marseillaise. The dedication reads, arranged for the forte piano by the citizen C. Balbastre, to the brave defenders of the French Republic, the year 1792 of the Republic. The work dates from a time when the demand for politically inspired music was at its height, and nationalist sentiment focused upon the defenders of the revolution, celebrating their bravery and dedication to liberty. And this urgency and fervour can be heard in the opening of Balbastre's setting, with emphatic unison octaves and arresting chromatic harmony. Then follow two variations, with a popular song, the Ça ira, used as a lively coda at the very end. Combat is depicted by a two-part dotted figure, and the flight of the enemies is expressed by a 4-octave C major scale in semiquavers. Note clusters, or cannon fire, lead to the dancing victory of the Ça ira. That Balbastre used it to save the organ of the deconsecrated Notre Dame Cathedral from marauding revolutionaries has largely been discredited. But after 1792, there was indeed an increased risk to all artists for appearing counter-revolutionary. Jacques-Louis Ménetre's journal reveals how petty jealousies and slights of honour could escalate into politicised vengeances, and many arts practitioners fell foul of oppressive measures. The poet André Chénier was guillotined in 1794, and the painter Jacques-Louis David was imprisoned in both 1794 and 1795. Whether BALBASTRE music was motivated by belief or pragmatism isn't clear, but it is likely that he, like many of his contemporaries, was simply taking advantage of the huge popularity of Rouget de Lisle's song and the demand for printed music. To conclude this section, it's possible to observe a link between Catholic and Republican rites and a continuity of techniques and improvisation or accompaniment styles of the Ancien Regime across the revolutionary musical panorama. The recognition of the ongoing value of the organ, the technical skill of the organists and their ability to adapt to the different requirements of the designers of the revolutionary cults brought an important level of protection. In addition, the didactic project of the administration, whereby the organ helped to convey a specific educative and emotional message, often to a crowd in an outdoor environment that was unfavourable to the spoken word, brought about a transformation from controlled religious icon to what the musicologist Xavier Bissaro has called a technically exemplary object. As one Republican official commented, "When the beauty of the pipes and a lovely quality of sound are found to be united, you must not hesitate to conserve it. Since it can be used much more advantageously in the public sphere, it will facilitate improvement of this sublime art which has such power over the soul and which must be a part of the Republican education." The revolution was both destructive and creative, and the story of the organ during the revolutionary decade was one of continuity and of change. A huge number of instruments were lost, and others were moved, abandoned, sold, broken up for raw materials, or exposed to industry or the elements. The history and associations of the classical French organ, wrapped up in Louis XIV's cultural endeavour and the prestige and wealth of the church, could have led to its complete destruction. Instead, a nucleus of instruments survived to lend an element of legitimacy and brilliance to Republican worship and festivals. And in this way, the organ was shown to have an ongoing symbolic, aesthetic and historic value. The new forms of political involvement experienced in revolutionary Paris meant that inhabitants were well aware of the contested nature of shifting discourses, and the organ gained an expanded meaning capable of dignifying the memory of those interred in the Panthéon or leading the singing of patriotic song. Although wonderful examples of Ancien Régime organs still exist in France today, notably at the cathedral in Poitiers and at the priory at Souvigny, the confluence of the work of François-Henri Clicquot and Aristide Cavaillé-Coll at Saint-Sulpice in Paris demonstrates how pre-revolutionary and 19th century aesthetics are not mutually exclusive. An examination of the specification of this 102-stop instrument reveals that the majority of ranks, 51, are by Clicquot, and the instrument is essentially a hybrid. Furthermore, the compositional style of the second half of the 19th century has its roots in the music of the opera and festivals of the Revolution, the quality of which was revolutionary in itself. The idioms inherited by César Franck, Guillemot and Widor, such as the pièce héroïque, the march, vocalise, romance, and the imposing grand chœur, owe much to the earlier composer's desire to write in a new, didactic and expressive revolutionary style. Patriotic self-fashioning resulted in music that was consciously nationalistic and intensely extrovert. And finally, it's possible to see that despite the disruption of the revolution, the French organ school remained vigorous, international and multifarious. This was not an atrophying tradition ready to be swept away. It was capable of remodelling itself to the events of the 1790s, and the organ was arguably a beneficiary of the years of upheaval. A conviction persisted that organ performance, in the preservation of tradition and as the outlet for contemporary taste, the articulation of worship and of artistic aspiration, had enduring power and worth. As Antoine Christophe Merlin commented in 1794, "It may not be such a poor service to France to put this instrument in a place of honour."